Where we left off last time, we were talking about a second model for compression, where we were treating our bits as self-extracting. So in this model, what we did is we treated the algorithm and the compressed bit stream as a single sequence of bits, which allows us to more carefully think about some of the neat consequences of compression. So we had an example of this, which was called self-extracting hugplant.java, and in that file we had the coding try at the front, and then we had the code words, and then somewhere else in the file we also had the code actually needed to decompress the encoding. That is, we have all the Huffman data, all the bits we get by Huffman encoding, and the appropriate instructions that are needed to decompress that encoding. We pass that along to an interpreter, and it will spit back out the bitmap file that we originally compressed with the Huffman coding code. So the goal of a compression algorithm, of course, is to reverse this process. So given a sequence of bits, this is hugplant, we want to feed it through a compression algorithm that can somehow turn it into some kind of self-extracting archive. And a good compression algorithm is one that's able to take bit streams that we care about and turn them into shorter bit streams. Okay? And so I ended last time with a bit of a puzzle, which was, okay, well, we had some way to create a 2 million bit version, 2 million bit compressed version of hugplant.bmp, and I said, well, I, by the way, happen to have a 29,000 bit version that can produce these 8 million bits. This is a much better compression ratio. This is a 25% compression ratio. This is only a quarter as big, and that's really good because it is extremely unlikely that any given bit stream is going to be able to be shrunk by 25% for the counting reasons we discussed last time. Here, Mystery X, whatever it is, it achieves a 0.35% compression ratio. And the way we can count it out, if you just use a counting argument, well, how many bit streams are there of this length? Well, there's 2 to the 8,389,584. How many bit streams are there of this length? Far fewer. So, as it happens, only 1 in 2 to the 8,360,151 bit streams could possibly be generated by one of these bit streams of that length, right? There's just so many bit streams of this length and so few of this. So, somehow, this bit stream is very special. Or this one's very special because there's some short bit stream that can produce it. So I had you guys think about what that bit stream might be, and someone observed that it's just probably the program I used to generate it in the first place. So I wrote a program called hugplant. It had a whole bunch of functions and variables, and it was decomposed in this nice modular way. And because it had a really deep representation of the structure of this plant, if you look at it, right? I mean, if you see it, it's a bunch of rectangles, and there's some, color shifting as it goes up. And so it is that if you have those primitives in mind, if I'm thinking about rectangles and colors, then I can produce an image in a more efficient way than Huffman coding, which is a fairly dumb algorithm, right? I mean, it just looks for symbols that aren't used very often, okay? And so this raises the question, it goes back to the one we had here, this idea of a compression algorithm. Given a bit stream, what is the shortest bit stream C sub B that can output it, right? How do we actually go backwards? And that's an interesting question we'll talk about in the next section of this lecture. But I guess the main point here really, so I began the last lecture by saying this couple of lectures is going to be about weird stuff. We're going to talk about the mystery that if you leave hydrogen in the universe, it eventually coalesces into heavier elements, and it starts self-replicating, get these self-replicating structures, and eventually you get self-awareness. And that's kind of an amazing feat for a universe with relatively simple physics, right? I mean, that's just crazy to imagine. You can have a universe where the laws of physics just aren't that big a deal. I mean, we don't know them all, of course, but we have a pretty good handle on more or less how things work, and yet we get amazingly complicated things. So along these lines, there was this interesting observation. In the 1970s, Mandelbrot, who you may know, he built demonstrations that you could write relatively short programs or procedures that generate highly complex visual patterns. With only a few bits, you could produce images like this. This is a fractal produced by a computer. It's a relatively simple piece of code. And here is a Romanesco broccoli, which is a very complicated piece of broccoli. When you look at it, it's got this fractal pattern. And it turns out that biological processes exploit these same ideas, these notions that a relatively small procedure or short procedure can give rise to very complex behavior. Just as you and I, right? We have relatively short sequences of DNA. We're less than a gigabyte of information in our DNA, but we produce this incredibly complicated thing with all these neat spatial patterns, cognitive patterns. So this original small amount of data is able to produce something far more complicated than itself, right? Just these number of bits can produce this complicated plan, just as DNA can produce, well, this complicated plan. So it is the case, of course, that you've seen fractals, but one thing I doubt you've seen, and maybe you have, is this in the context of sound generation. So there's actually also audio fractals, and so let me give you a little demo of how these work. So what's going to happen in this video is that at the bottom, we're going to have code at the bottom, very simple short sequences of code that's going to be fed through an interpreter, and then sound is going to be generated from that code. Okay, so here's some code, and it's in a language you guys don't know, JavaScript. So don't worry too much about the details, but do focus on the fact that it's extremely short, and it produces this seemingly very musical sound. And so on Lab 14, you will be building this, basically. Something quite similar to this. Let's see another more impressive one. Let's see. So let's go to 21. Okay, again, this is the program. There's a little expression here. So this is all that's needed to produce the sound. This is fed to some sonification code, but this is the smarts of it. Okay, so there's no drop or anything. It's a short program. Let's see a little more complexity than even that. Okay, so again, this is the whole program. So somehow this has always impressed me a little more than visual fractals. It seems so personal, so human. Okay, pretty astounding. Alright, and here's a super ridiculous one. Some more bits. So I think there's actually quite a lot of profundity here, right? Like, a short bit sequence is able to produce this, right? And in some sense, a lot of things in the world, you and I, and all of our complexity, maybe we take advantage of this. I mean, it could well be that our minds are, in some sense, some kind of DNA fractal. So the punchline here is simply that a relatively short sequence of bits can produce very complex behavior, either in sound, visually, or even potentially in some other crazy domains like cognitively. So Kurzweil, he's a bit of a kooky character, but he suggests in his book How to Create a Mind that, in a sense, the brain is a recursive probabilistic fractal, because we only have, as I said, less than a gigabyte, actually far less, of information inside our genome, and yet we have the most complex machine in the entire universe. I mean, Microsoft Word is more bytes than our brain, if you think about the DNA content. And perhaps it is the case, I mean, I don't know, that our brains take advantage of the same situation here, where these seemingly really human, personal, and complex traits like this, or the sounds we just heard, play a role. So in Lab 14, I don't know if you really can appreciate that sound thing other than like, oh, okay, that's really remarkable, little electro music. Once you build it, I think you'll be a little more stunned. So I encourage you to really try and get through what's called the strange bitwise generator. I think it'll be worth it.